Welcome to our backyard. This is the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We are two friends having a discussion after everyone else has passed out or gone to bed. Grab a drink and listen as we discuss everything from automation, space exploration, and why the meaning of life is 42. Mike, do you think a pesticide that was designed to kill spiders, keep them out of your house, is all that's needed to prevent Spider-Man from getting bad guys?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know about Spider-Man, but I definitely think it would work on Ant-Man. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I think Spider-Man's got too much human in him, but maybe Ant-Man, because he's so small, Paul Rudd doesn't stand a chance. We're going to be talking about pesticides. That includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, all kinds of chemicals that are used to kill a certain target, animal, plant, well, not mammals, but insects. We're going to be talking about where pesticides came from, what they're used for today, the pros and cons, and what we might see in the future. Before we get into that, I'm going to ask you a very important question, Mike. How are you doing, and what are you using today to kill your liver?
Damn, you beat me to the punch. I was gonna make a drinking a poison joke, but I'm drinking some Jack Daniels and doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm drinking some dead guy ale. Kind of excited to talk about pesticides. This is kind of what I do for a living. Part of my job involves killing things so that other things can grow. And it's actually a common thing in agriculture. But before we get into kind of common or our time pesticide use, I want to talk about where pesticides came from. Pesticides pretty much came from the same, pretty much as soon as we were doing agriculture, farming, we started using rudimentary pesticides. So whether that be salt or heavy metals to keep off certain insects, or maybe we found out that a certain heavy metal would keep a certain off-species plant off our farm. And since then, we've been experimenting with different chemicals, different whatever we can get our hands on to try and make it so that our fields only have what we want to grow in them. And it's not too uncommon in nature for certain plants to make their own, what we would call herbicides today, that kill other plants around them so that only they can grow. So it's kind of another idea we stole straight from nature.
Yes, humans have been doing some form of protective farming, I guess is a word for it. Some organic, quote unquote, organic methods are still being used today, which I assume we'll talk about later in the podcast. But I wouldn't say until about I don't know, I'd be jumping too far ahead, the 1800s, the 20th century-ish, that's when more modern chemicals, what we think of in our mind came to be. I don't know if that's too far ahead of your thinking there, Nick.
No, I was just about to make that jump after I took a swig. Today we kind of know herbicide or pesticides. Break it down real quick. So pesticides encompasses pretty much, it's a broad term. It can include herbicides, which kill plants, insecticides, which kill insects, fungicides, kill fungus, and those are probably the big three. I mean, your biggest one by far is herbicides. Most of the pesticides applied in the United States are herbicides in the agriculture, and then I think the second largest user is actually golf courses of herbicides. But so you have the big three, and pesticides have a bad rap in our current time of what's now 2021 because of the book Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, about the harmful effects of DDT, which pretty much everyone, and by everyone I mean pretty much from the United States to Russia to third world countries, were using to control the mosquito population, because mosquitoes, which everyone kind of knows, spread a lot of bad diseases from malaria to West Nile. And so everyone was using that to lower the mosquito population, malaria cases go down, life expectancy goes up for humans. DDT had a bad effect on
Living things.
Certain bird species. Yeah, certain bird species, apex predators. Their eggs, it made the shells of their eggs really soft, so they would like be squished by the parents, the mother, which is not good. And so then we kind of took a collective we as the United States developing world took a collective look and said, wait a minute, are these things more dangerous than we thought? And it turns out, yeah, DDT is in fact bad. And there's other herbicides that not as well known, DDT is kind of the main one, that we took a second look at and decided that they needed to go. And so the United States created the Federal Insecticide, Fungus, and Rodenticide Act, most commonly known as FIFRA. And FIFRA is one of the big ones that regulates pesticides in the United States. And that goes through the whole kind of process of how does a pesticide become registered with the government? How does it become kind of labeled? What are its uses? How do you apply to get something registered? And so everything goes through a review, and then after so many years, it gets reviewed again. So if you don't mind, Mike, I was going to talk about how pesticides become registered once they're created.
Before you hop into that, I want to add a little history to it. I don't wholeheartedly agree with your earlier statement of that one lady just kind of ruined pesticides, herbicides. The 20th century wasn't exactly great for chemical control and use. And DEET wasn't the only one of it. I mean, we've been using, from what I understand in doing research of this, the United States kind of hopped on full board with using pesticides in the 1940s to save the potato crops, especially because it's World War II and they need the potatoes to help feed their troops. But humans aren't always the great at using chemicals. So to say pesticides do not get a bad rap is kind of ill-guided, because they definitely did not start off with the greatest intentions in the 20th century.
Neither did most tools used by man. Same as dynamite, maybe firearms, nuclear weapons.
Wasn't dynamite used to make nitroglycerin safer so less people would die in mining?
Yeah, but that's what the creator made it for. But then people figured out we could blow people up with it.
I'm not seeing a problem with this. But anyhow, continue.
So I guess what I meant to say, I guess more accurate words would be, is that in the past, I guess no one really questioned anything about herbicides. And after Rachel Carson's book, more people were aware of the harmful effects of herbicides. Does that seem more right?
She kind of brought it to public eye. I would agree with that statement.
Cool. Yeah, so that led to legislation being created, like I mentioned, FIFRA. So we have all these herbicides, and they have to go through some kind of test to determine, well, if we can use them, or who can use them, that whole kind of thing. So the big thing to taken from FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which I'm not going to say again, it's going to be called FIFRA from now on.
Wait, can you say that one more time, Nick?
I can. I'm just going to say FIFRA again, Mike, if that'll help you. So the biggest takeaway is that it uses the term for pesticides that it cannot have an unreasonable adverse effect on the environment. And that's taken to mean any unreasonable risk to man or the environment, taking into account the economic, social, and environmental cost and benefit of the use of any pesticide, or a human dietary risk from residues that result from use of a pesticide in or on any food inconsistent with the standard under Section 408 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So basically what that says is, if you're going to the pesticide you create is harmful, it better provide a ton of benefit to be used. There needs to be more pros than cons, is kind of what FIFRA says. So who makes pesticides? There's a few companies that do, and they're getting smaller every day. Or they're not getting smaller, they're just absorbing the companies that are small, because it takes a lot of money to get a pesticide made, anywhere from $2 million to $2 billion, because you need to do all the chemistry. So you need to figure out kind of different ones depend. But so let's say, okay, you're trying to make like a specific, I only want to target a certain invasive species. So you have to figure out, have a botanist tell you what in the interior of that plant is different from most of the surrounding plants, so you don't get a lot of off-species kill. Or you could go for a broad spectrum, but that really wouldn't pay off. So when I say broad spectrum, that's an herbicide or a pesticide that kills a lot of plants. We already have cheap broad spectrum herbicides, so you really aren't going to waste too much money inventing a new one unless you think you're going to get a high reward, because if you're not going to get a high reward for your product because it costs so much to make, why you're not going to make it. So you figure out what you're trying to do and then how to do that. Once you think you have your pesticide, then it goes to the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And this is EPA. This is a point that I want to clarify because I see this a lot from anti-pesticide groups, is that this is their quote, big companies are just paying the EPA to register their products. No, what's going on is the companies need to provide the capital so that the EPA can pay the man hours needed to run all the tests on every product to determine its efficacy. So essentially what that payment that the companies are making to the EPA just gets put back into the scientists who test that. That's just their paycheck that they're getting paid for. And so they do a lot of different tests. First off, does it work? So they'll test the pesticide on a field or wherever, some kind of test area, and they'll measure, they'll find out certain things about it, its half-life, as well as one of the initial tests, you're going to do your toxicity test. Is it toxic to humans? Does it react with certain things? Can it be stored, in warm place? Like if it's stored in a warm place, what's it going to do? Stored in a cold place, what's it going to do? The big toxicity tests, they are mostly done on rats. And so the way they do this is they feed rats, mice, whatever animal you're using to measure with, the pesticide that's in question. And then they see kind of how much it takes to kill most of that population, or how much it takes to kill half, to figure out the relative toxicity. So they call this value your LD50, or your oral LD50 value. It's basically how much is required to kill half the members of a population. So if you have, something like a nerve agent or something, you have like a cap full, like a ounce of nerve gas, it's going to take half of that to kill 50% of the population or something like that. But the common ones, like the one that's talked about in the news, glyphosate, has a relatively low oral LD50 value, which means it's actually less than salt. I'm trying to bring it up here. But so if you had salt and glyphosate, you'd have to drink more glyphosate, Roundup, for those who are not familiar. You'd have to drink more Roundup than you would have to eat more salt to kill you first.
Please do not drink Roundup. Just want to throw that out there.
Or eat more salt than your body weight.
Well, I don't think a human can do that. So you could. I'm not gonna say anything. Actually, never mind. Continue, Nick.
So for every kilogram you weigh, you'd have to consume 50 milligrams of glyphosate to kill half of the population. So there's two people standing next to each other, and you both weigh, I don't know, Mike, help me out. What's an average weight in kilograms?
85.
So 85 kilograms. Okay, so times.
So in case anyone's wondering, it's 2.2 pounds for every kilogram. That's the conversion. So 85 kilograms is like, I don't know, 178 pounds. Fun fact, since Nick's doing math right now, toxicity has an equation. I learned this when looking up. It's hazardness times exposure time. That usually gives you your toxicity, which I thought was very interesting, how us humans always adding math to everything. Somehow we came up with an equation for toxicity, which for some reason I extremely enjoyed. Speaking of math equations, Nick, you got yours figured out?
16 ounces of glyphosate will kill you, compared to 9 ounces of table salt will kill you. When honestly, I really think I could eat more salt than that.
Well, we're Americans, so of course we can.
That's very true. But yeah, so And I think it's important to note that glyphosate is used to treat plants and as such is not meant to be ingested. Just throw that one out there.
Yeah, it's kind of like Tide Pod. It's really good at cleaning your clothes, but maybe don't put it in your body on purpose.
Yeah. While we're talking about glyphosate, or we're going to come back to it, I'm going to continue to talk about how the pesticides get labeled and regulated. So someone goes through the process creating a pesticide, sends it to the EPA. The EPA does the toxicity test as well as the efficacy test. Does this pesticide do what it say it does? Because no one's going to buy a pesticide that, well, doesn't kill anything. So they do all these tests. It takes anywhere from like 7 to 12 years to get a pesticide once it's from its creation through the registration process. It's kind of like medicine where once it's created, it's got, I can't remember, like I think it's like 15 years. It's quite a while where it's patented. Then after that time, the patent is open and people can make generic versions, which is why glyphosate Roundup, it's an older pesticide. It's the most common one because it is older and it's past all the regulations. And so anyone can make it and it's relatively cheap to make. As well, part of the FIFRA, it might not be FIFRA, it might be another one, but part of the regulation of pesticides is once they're out on the market, they still undergo review. They're still doing long-term reviews to determine, like, do they cause cancer? Or what is the long-term effect of using this? Which, like I said, it already takes a while to do that registration process. So they're observed that whole time. But it's not, once they're out on the market, doesn't mean that it's over. They can be pulled if we find out that, oh, shit, this causes cancer.
Yes, I think that is important to note, but I am always very wary of the testing for pesticides because it's a kind of an imperfect system. There's so many variables. When you have so many variables, it's like near impossible to calculate them all. So that's not the argument against it. It's just saying when there's that many variables and pieces on the board, it's hard to control everything. Also, I would like to know more about their structure and regulations because a lot of the wording I came across was this acceptable amount, which it's acceptable to who, because unfortunately a lot of times they didn't have their sources, and acceptable for what? Humans come in all shapes and sizes, many different backgrounds. I imagine it affects people differently. So that's a lot of variables. That was just a caveat of mine. I would like to know more about the in-depth of their testing because I imagine they're doing it more. If they have to at such a scale they're working on is generic humans, weight, size, diet, and other chemicals it might get mixed in with. There's so many variables. So that's my only little asterisk to that. Sorry, Nick, please continue.
No, you're good. So I will say, they don't test on humans, obviously, but they do mostly test on like rats, and they'll test like pregnant rats, see if that has a different reaction. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but pigs and dogs are pretty close to humans, and they'll also test on them to figure out the effect. And this isn't an EPA test, but because people are people, there's usually a good amount of evidence of people swallowing herbicides, mostly glyphosate, trying to kill themselves. And there's been 80 cases of ingestion of glyphosate as trying to kill yourself. And I don't know how many of them lived. 79 of those were suicides. I don't know who was the guy who accidentally drank it. But so we do kind of know just from people's trial and error, I guess. But most of the testing, like I said, is actually not most. Testing's not ever done on humans. It's all plants or rats and maybe cows, or not cows, pigs and dogs. And then, of course, when you're talking about like stuff that goes into ag, so if you're doing production for like a dairy beef production, then yeah, they're going to spray the pesticide over the field for however long, and usually there's waiting periods. So if you treat your field for whatever, you usually have to wait for the, couple half-lives of whatever you spray so it decomposes before you let the cattle back into the ground. And then there's something else you said that I wanted to get to. Oh, safe. Who determines what is the cost benefit? So I don't know if I can answer this is exactly the answer you're looking for, but so it is an economic versus health benefit, right? So there's certain pesticides that are called restricted use pesticides, RUPs for short, and those are pesticides that you need to have some kind of license to get, and you can use those. But like I said, it's restricted from the general population to use. So it's generally only agriculture or some kind of industry that uses them, and they might be because they have some quality that's detrimental to health. So one of the ones that we use is Rosol, and it's a rodenticide, and it kills a rodent that eats baby trees. And so that's one of the ones that we use that is harmful to people. It's one of our, I don't know,
more toxic,
higher toxicity ones. And the reason that it's used is that it saves people a lot of money to do a trapping in combination with that, and that it's not really going to run off. Really, the only thing it kills is more rodents. So since it's a little bit more deadly because humans shouldn't eat it, but it's not really going to leach because it's like a solid pellet, that it's considered okay. So yeah, I see what you're saying, is that who is a person who says, well, if it's this deadly, it's okay if it provides this greater good.
When it's something that affects me, I want to know this and about it, and like the interworkings of it. I don't like it's probably just my own downfalls, but I don't like relinquishing control to someone else over my own well-being. And well, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides are all, well, they're in everything we eat and consume, from international foods brought in to the home foods in our backyard. It's amazing how much pesticides are used in the United States, let alone, I don't even know the numbers for the world, but just a few little numbers and quick facts for you. About 3.2 million tons of pesticides are used every year. And about, we were talking about people using heavy chemicals and stuff like that. About 2.2 people are at risk, heavy quotations at risk, because I'm not quite sure, and they did not define at risk, because that could mean quite a big things. That's up for interpretation. But at least 2.2 million people are quote unquote at risk due to agriculture, pesticides, and Jesus Christ, more than $14 billion are spent on pesticides in the U.S. each year. So those chemicals are everywhere. So I want to know where the money's going, how it's being spent, and knowing it's true, going through the loops of how it is researched before implemented.
Okay, so let's try and break that down. So you want to know, what do you mean, where's the money going? It's going to the EPA? Is that, or like who's spending the money?
I would say more spending the money and how they're spending the money. Because, I mean...
well, they're buying shit ton of pesticides.
That's not necessarily true. Because if we look at, I don't know, the education system, where a lot of money goes to administrators, not to the students or the teachers, I imagine that's the same for many other industries, and I imagine the pesticide industry is no different. So it'd be nice if the EPA was... I think it's a government agency, so I think it's technically you could subpoena for the information.
It is definitely a government agency.
Yeah, so I'd be definitely curious, because I did not do research on how they do their spending. Not that they spend, but like how they do the spending. What do they prioritize?
Yeah, I don't know. Don't know that much about the inner workings of the EPA. But you can, sounds like you're kind of worried about like the pesticides. I mean, you can look all that up.
Sort of. So, one, we missed a spider pig joke we probably should have done in the beginning. So, one, humans weren't perfect. And I imagine that with pesticides and insecticides, what we figure is okay now, again, like I mentioned earlier, with so many variables, we don't know the long distance effects. We know now long distance, key asterisk on what I said by long distance, because Yes, the half-life. Yes, it takes it. I mean, long distance might be for research 50 years for the pesticides they're currently doing. I don't know. But I'm thinking even longer term than that because those chemicals will dissipate. Those chemicals, fun fact, it takes quite a long time for it to get to groundwater for certain chemicals. Glyphosate not being one of them. I was quite surprised. Glyphosate dissolves kind of instantaneously, so it's kind of weird that we use it. Just the longer term effects, which you can't really research because we need it for the market. You need it kind of now. But anytime humans are involved and that much money is involved, I'm always wanting to dot my I's and cross my T's.
But I mean, like glyphosate, like we have probably 70 years now of data on that. And I would say that I haven't seen anything.
I was going to say one chemical does not stand for all of them. If I was looking.
Yeah, but that's so when you're talking pesticides, I mean, I would bet that 50% of all pesticides applied, or I'd say 25% of every single pesticide applied in the United States is glyphosate.
Yeah, that seems about right. But how does glyphosate react with all the other chemicals, specifically new chemicals?
Like, what do you mean? How do they aid in decomposition, or how do they react together doing their job? Or
this might be a little far ahead, so maybe we should jump into different deploying methods of the pesticides because there's quite a few different ways, and those different ways have different problems of their own, which could lead to what I was just talking about.
Okay, can we hold that thought while I mention one thing real quick?
Sure.
So we've been talking a lot about glyphosate specifically, Roundup, probably the most common version of glyphosate. I'm sure most of everyone has seen the commercials. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, call some lawyer to get some money. So that study was done by the IARC, which is a international cancer research, and the WHO, to go through a bunch of different just things, like a ton of things, to figure out what causes cancer. And so then someone in California spilled so glyphosate was put on the list of probable carcinogens. Someone spilled some glyphosate on himself in California, sued, I think, Bayer at the time. I think it's still Bayer. I don't know exactly, but one of the larger chemical production companies. The Ninth Circuit Court of California said that the person wins, and they won like millions of dollars. The study that the WHO IARC one referenced, they were injecting cells with glyphosate at a level that you wouldn't find naturally unless you douse yourself with it. And then that cell would then explode and say, oh, look, people die. Their glyphosate kills people. But if you don't believe me, look it up. But I do want to list the WHO IARC list of probable carcinogens, list some of the big ones. Like I said, we have glyphosate. We have biomass fuel, aka wood from like a fire. We have red meat, like from beef.
Isn't Starlight in there too somewhere?
Yeah. I think it's somewhere in there. Malaria is in there, and non-arsenic insecticides. Yeah, shift work. That just shift work if it disrupts your circadian rhythm. Very hot beverages, parentheses, above 65 degrees Celsius. Yeah. So take what you want from that. My takeaway is that I'm not going to stop eating red meat, and I'm probably not going to stop drinking hot chocolate. So I guess I'm going to get cancer. But let's move on, Mike. You were talking about the ways chemicals are applied, unless you had something to add.
Well, I just want to add one other thing is we've been focusing heavy on glyphosate. Glyphosate, from what I could tell, is through and through pretty safe. Like, I mean, with any chemical, with anything actually in the world, like even a pair of scissors, there's always some dangers with it. But from what I can see, glyphosate is pretty well-rounded. Get it? Roundup, well-rounded.
Nope.
God damn it.
Not. What if puns was on the list of probable carcinogens?
Oh, then I'm stage 3. But I just want to say that there are many other chemicals that are different and they interact with each other differently, which is ones I'm more worried about. The ones through and through that have been, well, like you said, Nick, used for about 70 years, less worried. But the ones I am worried about can intermingle together depending on how they're dispensed. And boy, there are quite a different ways for dispensing. I think one of the coolest methods, that just because might be me because I want to, drop some air bombs, is kind of something you're a little bit more familiar with, Nick, is airplanes dropping and kind of crop dusting crops.
You call that aerial application.
Aerial application. Good to know. That seems to be quite effective, but it also has many weak spots in the armor. Kind of the obvious one being wind. Wind is kind of a deadly enemy of aerial irrigation, and wind can very easily pick up those chemicals and put them where they're not supposed to be. Now, granted, if it's like glyphosate, it's not the biggest a deal, but if you're doing more exotic plants, or if you're trying a certain chemical because some invasive species in there, so you need to bring in a more heavy-duty one, etc., that all makes a big difference. And especially if you're near a still body of water, specifically, a lot of these chemicals I noticed don't really affect too much the groundwater. Now, granted, a lot of these chemicals I saw take a while to get to the groundwater. Some of these half-lives, yes, when they're exposed, nature and surface, they're by the book, exactly what the science says. But when they get intermingled with other chemicals and they go deep into the soil and some other X factor happens, they sometimes have a tendency to make it to the groundwater, which takes sometimes over a year, sometimes years to get to. But that's one that I don't know why it's cool that we're dispensing food-saving chemicals through airplanes. It seems kind of old-fashioned, but yet still modern.
Yeah, so so I do a lot of this with a helicopter, not a plane. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So you mentioned wind, and wind is a huge factor, not just for the application, but also legally. So every pesticide comes with a label, and it has to say on the label that it's okay for aerial application. And it'll usually have certain wind numbers. Usually it's like nothing above like 10 miles an hour. And legally, so I'm just talking about the state of Oregon here, for the Oregon Forest Practices Act, you can't spray above 10 miles an hour. And that may sound like a lot, but it's not really when we really don't spray above 5 miles an hour. And I'll tell you why. So first we use our herbicides to kill competing vegetation to establish our Douglas fir crop trees. So if there's wind, it's pushing our pesticide away from the target area and pushing it towards a water source, which is, we have buffers on water sources that protect the water from the pesticide. So we can't spray within 100 feet of water, basically. There's certain different measures for different size streams, but just throw that out there to kind of not complicate things. So when you have high wind, that pushes your chemical into that no spray buffer, and then there's no way to explain why there's dead trees or dead grass inside your buffer to the state. So there's a legal ramifications, as well as we know that coming from the industry, like I said, I work in this industry, we know that as an industry, we are one mistake away from losing this tool forever. Chemical application is one of the most stressful things that I do.
With great power comes great responsibility. And I would definitely say the ability to produce more food so people don't starve, and at the same time, the double-edged sword where if you mess up, you could kill things or people. So I definitely high responsibility. One method I saw...
Okay, real quick, sorry. I was going somewhere, but then I tried to explain a little bit more. So during aerial application with a helicopter, like I said, wind is a huge problem, the problem. So we have to be out on the unit in the morning, spray for an hour or two before the winds pick up. Now, we use AccuFlow nozzles, and that creates a larger droplet size for herbicides, and larger droplet size is less affected by the wind. there's people in the past used to use, they're called CP3 nozzles, and they created a very fine mist. The mist was so fine, any wind above like 3 miles an hour and your chemical was gone. So you couldn't really spray too much. So those nozzles are used for more fine applications, like stuff you need a double coat for, usually like insecticide work, I believe. I don't know. We don't really do too much of that. Actually, I have yet to do any insecticide work, but I think that that's when you really need a fine coverage, that's more what that's for. So we use larger droplet sizes to keep our chemical where we want it. You can also add stuff to, like, there's a chemical crosshair, and I'm sure you can find all sorts of generics to do the same thing. And what it does is you add it to your mix, and it makes it your droplet size, changes the surface tension. What's the word I'm thinking of? Maybe it's that, of your water, so it keeps your droplets big, keeps them on target. And where that comes into play is larger droplet size. This is more coarse, so you're not getting the coverage you maybe want, but you're getting more on target than if you were using small size. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into this on the back end.
A lot of variables, that is for sure. I mean, it's literally chemistry. It's there's a lot to chemistry and a lot of different methods. One method I want to ask you, Nick, because when researching this, I came across this YouTube video. I don't know if this is commonly used or it's just one redneck farmer making do with what he's got. But you know the irrigation system that sprays water that rotates throughout crops?
A center pivot, circle pivot?
The ones on giant like A-frames that reach maybe, I don't know, 30 feet in length.
And then just move in a circle?
Yeah, sort of, yeah. But they're like on giant...
I think...
Well, I saw this man use a pump and pump in his own pesticide into that water dispensing system to help spray his crops, which I thought was ingenious, but I also don't know if that's common or if that's safe. The safe is I don't know which chemical he was using, so that takes care of that. But I was wondering, since you're a little bit more familiar with the agriculture world, is that a common way of dispensing pesticides?
I can't say whether that's common or not. I know most of the application is usually done from a tractor. It's not, but that's I don't know, I'd say that's like North Idaho. I don't know. That's just the one area I maybe know about. So I'm not sure exactly. You know, I know occasionally people will do aerially. I don't know if I can't remark on that off the top of my head.
Well,
but I mean, I don't see. I mean, it's the same thing if you're using it for irrigation, as long as you have a check valve on there and nothing's going back out. And I mean, so when they do it, so let's talk about corn. So corn's a row crop, right? So you have rows of corn. So when you do it by tractor, you have like a tank on the back of the tractor, right, with nozzles coming out, hanging out for both sides. Your nozzles hang down low in between the corn, so it gets down to the soil there, and one nozzle will treat 2 rows of corn. So if you have something like that set up where your circle is, you know, your nozzles from your water is spraying everything, then I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't. What I think the problem with that would be is that unless it's motorized, you're not getting a perfect coverage, so the amount of acreage could be off. You need like constant pressure, and you need to make sure that all your nozzles are working, and I don't know. It just doesn't seem like you would get good coverage that way. It seems like a lot of your pesticides your mix would come out the first couple heavier than at the end, if I had to guess, but I don't know.
Well, we covered the aerial. You mentioned the most common methodology, which is using a tractor to dispense the pesticides. I mentioned the redneck way, which may or may not be feasible. What other ways are there to dispense pesticides?
Besides those, pretty much by hand, by the ground. So you got guys with like a backpack that holds like a few gallons of mix, and they go and for steeper ground where you can't get a tractor, and they treat it by hand. This is most common out in the woods. I don't really know of too much industrial agriculture that's doing hand treatments. And I want to say, we're talking about mixes and pesticides, the predominant mix or the predominant ingredient of any pesticide mix is water. So if we're talking about application, so say we're doing an application from a helicopter, and we do 10 gallons of water, 10 gallons of mix per acre. So we'll do a standard like site prep mix. So no trees in the ground. We're going to try and kill all the competing vegetation so that our trees have their best chance of survival. They're not fighting for light resources or water resources. So we got usually 3 quarts. 3 is 32 ounces is a quart. So 3 quarts, 96 ounces, and then maybe we'll do some 6 ounces of imazapyr. So 96 plus 6, and then do another 4 ounces of like a sulfametron methyl, which is a solid. So you're really, out of the 10 pounds, only like a gallon of that is chemical, and that's per acre. So that's, I mean, that would be, if you were doing that in a room, the chemical would be like a shot glass spread through the room pretty much. So when you see all those things with all the big, tanks in the back, everything's pretty diluted. And so we also do a few other kinds, Mike. We do spot application. So for Scotch broom, which is an invasive species, we'll do a mix of kind of like a vegetable oil and triclopyr, and it just spray a ring around the base of the plant, and that'll kill it. And that's not, you don't target the whole unit. You're just going around finding one plant you're trying to kill and get that. And then another spot application we do is called a Basil Treatment. And so when we harvest a stand of timber and there's maples in there, we don't want the maples. They're not a crop tree. We don't get money for them. And they do. They resprout. So they'll come back with that root structure that they have, which will outcompete any of the trees you put in the ground. So what we do is, before the harvest, we come in and we hack them. So the guys come through with machetes and they hack like a circle around the tree that exposes the live parts of that tree, and then they'll take a squirt bottle and squirt a little bit of imazapyr in there, or sometimes a glyphosate, depending on what you're targeting. And then that's another treatment. There's all sorts of other weird ones too. There's a sponge treatment for roadside. So imagine, when you go to the car wash and that thing comes down with all the soap on it?
Yes.
It's basically that, except instead of soap, it's herbicides, and it is touching like the side of the road, and everything it touches gets the herbicide on it that then kills it. And the benefit of that is you're not limited by wind, because it's it's thick on the, I don't know what you'd call it, the sponge or whatever. And then there's fumigation. This isn't anything that we do. I just am thinking about random pesticide classes I've taken. So this is like if your cat has fleas, that thing you put in the room that just like goes psh, with all the anti-flea stuff, that's fumigation. Or like I've never actually seen one in person, but in movies how they put those giant tarps over the houses and then they put the stuff inside.
Yeah, like the clown-looking structures.
Yeah, so there's that. And then, like I said, this is kind of off topic from, you're more talking agriculture, but like rodenticides. So when we put out stuff for mountain beaver control, or people put out like mouse traps or ant traps, kind of stuff like that, that has an attractant that then will kill the whatever. I don't know if you consider that a pesticide or not.
I would. I mean, you're using, to me, pesticides you're using a chemical to help protect and flourish your crops or plants, and so to speak. That's, in my mind, what pesticides fundamentally do.
Yeah. So I'm sure I forgot a few, but do you know if there's anything I missed there?
For dispensing, no. But I do know all the dispensing, again, comes with some issues, especially if it's close to water. That's the main issue, is water, its location and wind. But if you're careful enough, that doesn't seem to be the biggest issues.
Yeah, so I want to say, not that I haven't said this before, but this is why it's important to buy products from developed countries like the United States, where we have systems put in place to protect water quality, and we have buffers and all that stuff. And we don't farm right up to the edge of streams, and we don't harvest trees right up to the edge of streams. We have buffers on all of that because they do not do that in third world countries, and they definitely don't do that in China. So,
So
and it's yep.
a lot of things I research when doing this is when people think of pesticides, they think of the poisons killing people. That was both a 20th century thing and not really a first world issue. A lot of the problems I saw with pesticides is developing nations, specifically in Asia, Central America, and South America. Central America, to me, based on the numbers I was reading, was the worst of the bunch. I imagine it's because they have a high export of goods, because, I mean, it's a tropic zone, so you can grow quite large range of things that other people can't. So I imagine, since being a third world country, having high exports, want to make it cheap as possible, quick as possible, make as much money as possible, that leads to unethical farming. For America and Europe specifically, Europe uses way less herbicides, pesticides, insecticides than I think anyone else in the world, besides, rural environments where tribes and stuff like that. I think,
So Europe actually banned most of their pesticides like 2 years ago.
yeah,
I
so
can't
that
remember now.
that was very surprising to me. I'm wondering how long term that's going to affect their farming. I know it probably won't
Well, they
affect.
haven't really had much of a farming community. Nothing compared to the United States.
Oh yeah, absolutely, completely agree with that statement. But it still will be interesting, because even though it's a smaller amount, it's still almost an experiment of seeing what happens when majority of the pesticides are removed. But again, the United States does a pretty good job at keeping the line towed. But again, from the misuse and poisoning of waters, what I saw were Central America, South America, and parts of Asia.
So I wanted to touch on the South Central America part. So it's kind of been talked about in the news, but I think I touched on a different podcast. But when I was working in Northern California, it's not uncommon for the cartel to grow marijuana plants out in Northern California and all over the place, and they put a lot of they'll bring pesticides that are actually illegal in the United States, smuggle them across the border to use out there, as well as what's like rat. They'll put rat poison on the actual plants so that the deer stop eating it. So that's a problem that we have. But I also the planting crews. Some of the guys who don't want to get anyone in trouble, but their brothers would work for the cartels. Not like what you're thinking, just, the cartels sell drugs. They got to make those drugs. So they'll most of the time they spend time, planting cauliflower or something, but occasionally they'll plant like pot plants or cocoa or something, but they also will do the spraying and stuff. And like they don't have any sort of like PPE. They don't have any kind of like anti, like when we used to do backpack applications, depending on the label, you have to have like gloves and waterproof gear, stuff like that. I'm sure they don't have any of that down there.
No, I imagine the safety regulations are non-existing for a lot of these regions. But that was my caveat of, when people think chemicals, they think poison. First world countries tend to be pretty good at it. But again, as our population increases, our food supply needs to stay with that demand. And when there's money on the table and a lot more demand, I'm quite worried that it's going to lead to misuses of pesticides just to keep up with it.
So there's something that we kind of touched on in the beginning that I want to bring up now that we're talking about kind of the future of pesticides. Organic does not mean pesticide free. And, well, I mean, that's pretty much all I had to say. So you can still use organic pesticides on organic crops as long as the pesticide's organic, and usually they're a lot less safe, and you have to use a lot more of them than I don't know, synthetic pesticides is what you would call them. But I do want to say that, here's like the pros and cons, right? So pesticide use enables American agriculture to be more efficient. We can grow more crops on less land and use less CO2 while doing it. When we stop using pesticides, we become less efficient, which may sound good because we're not using pesticides, but then that just means we have to cut down more forest or more prairie to grow these crops in to provide for everyone, which we're not going to do because odds are at that point we're just going to import all of our food from another country that probably isn't taking as good a care of the environment. And so, yeah, I would say that pesticides are a complicated issue and that they can be dangerous if used incorrectly. But we need to we need to use these pesticides to provide for the quality of living, the standard of living people have today. I mean, if you got rid of pesticides tomorrow, the price of every single food item would skyrocket, and the price of land, people would be buying land to farm. Well, like I said, I think we just import all of our stuff, which that doesn't make it any better. I don't know. What do you think, Mike?
All right, so pesticides are a dual-edged sword. They have great upsides, but they also have some downsides to them too. In the U.S., about $200 million annually is used for pollination because the pesticides are directly related to reducing pollinators, so they need to implement that, and that comes from the U.S. Agriculture Department, which $200 million to create more pollinators or to repollinate a new system because of the pesticides did an X factor to that generation. I don't know if the CO2 is offsetted. I just think maybe the CO2 is placed somewhere else. I think pesticides need to be used currently, but I don't think they're the best system we can use. I think we still need to keep moving forward and trying to figure out different ways and methods to do it because, again, it's a dual-edged sword. It's got great benefits. I mean, it keeps people from starving to death. It keeps food low, the prices at least. But it also has long-term effects, depending on which chemical it is, high economic effects for many different types of cultures of plants. And for dispensing and using is also extremely expensive. I mean, about 70% of the quote-unquote conventional grown fruits and vegetables, like, I don't know, like apples and bananas, they all have some sort of pesticide on them. I mean, hell, the biggest pesticides in the United States, I believe, are strawberries and spinach. The things we eat the most, we tend to want to protect, which leads to more pesticides on them. And from what I was reading, there's like 230, 260, above 200 different types of pesticides on everyday kind of common item foods. And again, everything in moderation is fine, but we're American. We don't want moderation. We want it all, and we all want it now. So that makes me very cautious and very worried about that.
So what I would say about that, and we've said this in multiple podcasts before, is that as Americans, we're so used to getting every food where we want it now. If we really wanted to make a big deal about reducing pesticide usage, we would get used to eating seasonally. We wouldn't grow crops where they don't need to be grown, and we would spend our dollars only buying food that's in season and not buying food that, we don't normally get these foods year round, or we'd get them canned or preserved or something. And so what I think that is more an effective is just that we're growing all sorts of food in places that maybe it shouldn't be grown because of the demand for it. Like, look at avocados right now. Avocados are trying to be grown everywhere just because there's a huge demand for them, even if they don't naturally grow there. And so you have to there's more pests and stuff there. You have to use more insecticide, fungicide, whatever to keep those things alive. Whereas and I'm not saying that I'm going to do this. I'm just saying that if people want to reduce pesticide usage, I don't think the answer is legislation. I think the answer is people saying, one, grow your own food. I mean, which is becoming more and more common nowadays, but also don't buy food out of season. Don't do that stuff that this is an issue to me that it seems it's more of I want the perfect solution and there is none, and people aren't willing to kind of be accountable for their own part in the whole thing.
I agree with that statement, but I would also want to add on that we're all in this together, so the fault can't just lie to one individual, especially for such a large industry, which is the agriculture industry. I think that's kind of a communion thing. So I agree and disagree at the same time. And since you brought up farming, there are some natural methods which I think could be quite promising for the future. So our ancestors, like Nick mentioned in the beginning, had methods to farm to keep away insects, rabbits, rats, other invasive species, etc., etc. And they seem to be making a comeback, like Nick said, with more people growing their food. I want to name two of them, and I want to talk about them a little bit because I think they could be very important for the near future and distant future. One of them being neem oil, Neem oil. This oil disrupts the life cycle of insects, biodegrades, it's non-toxic, it doesn't harm bees, butterflies, and ladybugs, which are kind of farmers' friends. And I see us being able to engineer that chemical structure of neem oil to keep it as it is, but perhaps more effective. Maybe a different strain of it to help dispense on it, to maybe replace some of the more deadlier, well, not deadlier, some of the more at-risk pesticides. And same with peppermint. I mean, the best defense is a good offense. Peppermint in the past and current day helps repel flies, mosquitoes, ants, beetles, ticks, even mice, squirrels, and rabbits. But do note that peppermint doesn't kill them. It just kind of it's a deterrent, not necessarily a stoppage of it. So if we could take that peppermint molecule and modify it to be more loud, so it's more like when you spray fox piss to keep away certain other animals, or wolf urine to keep away coyotes, etc., etc. If we do that with peppermint and we do that during certain seasons, or like neem oil, since it disrupts insect growth, we do that during certain seasons. It's more, I hate to say it, natural, which is it's not the right word for it, but it's the only one coming to my mind. But if we modify these molecules to be more beneficial to us, it seems to be, to me, Nick, I want to hear your opinion on it, bridging the gap between quote-unquote organic and synthetic. Do you see where I'm coming from here?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like your solution to pesticides is pesticides.
Yes. I think pesticides are a good idea. I just think they have
Well,
a
I mean,
lot of room
that's
for
like I
improvement.
said, like talking about bracken fern, which is a fern that naturally produces its own pesticides that kills plants around it. A lot of pesticides take their, get their inspiration or some piece from nature as well. I mean, we don't think of everything by ourselves, but you kind of, so your neem oil reminds me of 2,4-D in a sense. So 2,4-D is a common pesticide, used to be a lot more common, not as much anymore, but you'll probably know this because you can spray it over your lawn and it will not kill the grass. So there's a lot of certain pesticides that will only target certain species and leave others alone. So you can spray your lawn or whatever. And so we use it for roadside when we're trying to get rid of an invasive species like Scotch broom. And a heavy area like that, we'll spray 2,4-D because the 2,4-D will, along with triclopyr, will kill the Scotch broom, but it won't kill the grass. So it encourages grass growth, and that grass growth competes for light and water resources with the Scotch broom to help hinder it. So you're just talking about a more targeted approach, which is something that I think we didn't really mention, is how are herbicides chosen? Like, how do you decide what to spray on your field, stuff like that? It's not like a standard, you spray X, Y every year because. So you need to go out and you look and you say, okay, I have dandelions coming in, I have sword fern coming in. And then you got to look at what's around and say, okay, you know, am I going to be able to come back to this next year? Can I spray it again, or do I only get one shot at this? So every single prescription that you write is tailored to that specific area. And this is something that I think is a good point to bring up. Like I said, glyphosate's pretty cheap, but most pesticides aren't, or at least herbicides. There's especially the new stuff. There's a new
Nick, are you sponsored
herbicide
by
called
glyphosate?
no, I'm not. So there's glyphosate and glyphophosphate, and they're two separate ones. But glyphosate is just like the most common one, and so glyphosate we use a lot in our site prep. It's relatively cheap, $34 a gallon. I mean that's pretty as cheap as you're gonna get. Our most expensive, like Esplanade F, it's about $100 an ounce or something like that. It's for 5 gallons, it's about $5,000, and you apply at a 7 ounce an acre rate. You can, can't remember exactly the label, but we apply at a 7 ounce an acre rate. A lot of stuff's in between, anywhere from 64 to 100 something to 300, but it's expensive, so you don't want to waste it, especially if certain chemicals only treat certain species. So if you don't have that species there, you're wasting your time. One of the things that I think people don't realize is how much time is spent determining what to spray, because you want to use the least amount of chemical to go the most, you want the most bang for your buck. You want to get away with not using a bunch, but still getting your desired results. So there's a lot of just time and effort that goes into research of how to achieve that goal. And so I don't want people to get the idea that this is just like some dude going out with, a can of Roundup just spraying. And that's actually, so the Roundup I think you get in stores now, most of it's pre-mixed because the public didn't believe the label that said you only need like a certain amount of ounces to treat it. And they just completely soak whatever they're spraying, which is way over the label rate, which isn't good. And that's when you get bad stuff going on, because the plants don't die right away. A lot of times it takes like 3 months or so for them to die. So Joe Schmo homeowner sprayed Roundup on his plants. They're still there a week later. He was like, "Oh, it didn't work. Better spray it again." And so it's one of those things where I hate to be the guy who's like, "Oh, only professionals should do this," but maybe it's like more like a hunting license where you take a one-time class, just go over like label rates and stuff, and just to learn that, yeah, you only need like 3 ounces of this stuff to kill certain whatever. It's not just spray it completely out. And most states have if you think someone sprayed you or something nefarious happened, have a pesticide number. PERC, I think Oregon's like 811, their pesticide response center. And as the person who does the spraying, if you want to call that number, go right ahead. When we do a lot of applications by Neighbors Mike, we have the state come out, whether it's ODA, Oregon Department of Ag, or State Forestry, come out to observe, just to make sure we're crossing our I's, dotting our T's, and we're trying to hold everyone to that same standard of we're trying to do the right thing here. So it's better to be safe than sorry. I'd rather be, because here's, like I said, we're one mistake away from not having this happen. And so there's a lot of just crazy stuff that goes on out here that's about pesticides, just because it's such a volatile issue that I'd rather have someone come and investigate than the people make some video and then you only have proof that you were there and you sprayed it, and you take your weather conditions every hour. You take or if there's a weather change, you take your weather that includes your temperature, humidity, wind direction, wind speed, just to make sure you're not violating anything. And then you have that versus some person's word, and so it's easier just to have the state out there to begin with. But it's a pretty volatile issue, and I think just the way that our society is, where we just regulate everything, it's kind of crazy to me that you don't have to have a license. And I'm not saying people should. I'm just saying like all the shit you got to go through to purchase a firearm, all the shit you got to go through to drive a car. Yeah, you can just go to the hardware store and pick up some Roundup or whatever you want to spray.
That is very interesting. What also is very interesting to me is monocultures. So I would say that most agriculture in the entire world is monocultures, which makes it easier for pesticides because you're only trying to protect one thing and remove everything else. But at the same time, it also makes it harder. I think having non-monocultures farming would be better for A, needing less pesticides, B, that way you need also less fertilizers, less pollinators, a lot less everything. And I think that could be a possible solution I'm a big fan. All right. So I've said it once before on the podcast and I'll say it again. Nature gives us the answers. History tells us how to use them. We've seen ladybugs used before in the past to help fight other insects. Why not use other insects to fight other insects? I would say Nick, would you agree with me? We're saying the two biggest things that threaten crops are insects and invasive species.
I'd say it depends on the crop and location. Some it might be a disease or rust or some kind of disease. I'd say disease and insects per food would be the big two.
Okay,
maybe.
Then we'll just work with me a little bit. We'll go with diseases, and we'll go with insects. We'll say those are two major ones. Well, diseases, we could perhaps modify the plants, with genetic engineering, make them a little bit more resilient to rust, like wheat resilient to rust.
It's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, that kind of solves that problem. Now we're down to insects. Well, insects, I had a few ideas because we could use other insects to fight it. There are insects that are friends and not our enemies. Like there are insects that if we had more than a monoculture, they could survive off the culture that we don't harvest for profit, but rather the ones that we use for, helping introduce more nitrogen into the soil, help something with the rhizosphere system with those plants of getting more nutrients into them. That way we can help kind of fight that insect mythology. And also stemming from insects, rats, mice, birds, or stuff like that, we could add more. This is going to sound a little crazy, and Nick, I know you're not the biggest fan of it, but more snakes. We could add snakes to certain fields. I mean, there are already a lot of snakes in a lot of different fields, but if we added, a common rat snake, non-venomous, but effective against killing rabbits or mice that would destroy the crop, it seems like a win-win. It seems like I don't like having just one solution be the only solution because that never works out. You need to have multiple forms of attack at multiple different angles and a little bit of everything. I mean, many hands make small work. So to me, insects, we can genetically engineer plants to be more resilient. Granted, that's a whole nother argument for another conversation, whether we should or shouldn't, but we're doing it. It's saving lives. It's making people have more food in their bellies. So the insects to me is the major part. So another thought was have a sacrificial crop.
So before, let's come back to the sacrificial crop. So I'm going to talk about the insects thing. So that's what's called a biological control. So you have, so we talked about in a few other podcasts, but you have integrated pest management. It's essentially how do you treat your pests? First step, know your population. Okay, your population, how many pests are there? What's the most cost-effective way to treat that pest? What are your methods of control? The insects are the biological control method. It's a lot more expensive, and you don't get quick results. So that's kind of why it's not as popular. In, I would say, the industrial setting, you're going to find it a lot more in like the experimental setting just because they can afford the treatment and they can wait to do it. You'll see it in some smaller, like maybe more niche, like organic farms or something like that. I haven't really seen it take place in like a huge setting yet. Not that it couldn't. I'm just saying that that's what I've seen is that it seems to take a while. We had some insect control studies going on when I was in college with ladybugs. I forget what they're eating.
This might be a little off topic, but I would say modern farming has only been around for about 60 years. I I definitely think you could argue modern farming has been around longer, but I I would say for the last 60 years is where the true modern farming has been so made. So, and if we look at Earth's spectrum of scale, I mean, we haven't really done that many long-term experiments yet. I mean, long-term experiments to us might be a year, but in reality, it takes 3 years. But I'm gonna go back.
Well, so this is the problem with biological control. It's like what podcast we're talking about, but the predator prey population, right? So if you have a steady biological control, you have, your prey population, your pest population increases, and then after that, your predator population increases, but then your prey population goes down, but then your predator population goes down as well. Then your prey population skyrockets, and it's in that area that's when you really need that insect population to rise. Certain crops, it could be, you may not have, another 3 months of reproductive cycle to have those biological controls available to answer, say the ladybugs or something. So you can get around that, I guess, by if you had like some place there that just bred ladybugs that you could just like shoot out on demand. You just get them right away. But I think that might still be cost prohibitive. You have to have a large population of ladybugs that may or may not be needed depending on the population of prey. Whereas if you make like an insecticide, you can make a certain amount and then people can use what they need right when they need it. So I think that timing might be an issue there as well. But unless you had something, I keep getting you off track. You were talking about a sacrificial crop.
Well, I want to address the ladybug thing for a minute. I think a big issue is with monocultures. We've talked about with the disappearing bees where we're only focusing on one crop. It affects everything else from the pollinators to making it easier for diseases to take over entire fields, entire plantations. If we have non-monoculture farms, if we have even nearby forests, like you had 175 acres, right, of farmland, and you make 2 acres like a mini forest for, bees and ladybugs to pollinate, you're having both a long-term effect with the ladybugs and bees and a short-term effect with pesticides and insecticides. You can have both. You just have to be patient and you just have to think it through. Now, for sacrificial crops, I imagine if we have things such like peppermint and neem oil that can deter insects and diseases and other plants, etc., there must be plants that drive the insects crazy. Absolutely drive them crazy. So why not have some, I don't know, if you're having a really big booming season in potatoes, so you need cover crops, so some farmers are not going to, grow potatoes, so their plots could be empty, have them grow some cocaine-ish plant that bugs just absolutely love and get hooked on and addicted to. But if we modify them a little bit, make it poisonous for them, or at least attract them to it where there's maybe like a toxin on them that doesn't kill them right away, just disrupts their breeding cycle. If we have a sacrificial crop, or even like you mentioned earlier, Nick, there are some crops that natural dispense their own protection against other insects. If we have those alongside, say, soybean, corn, and I don't know if that would help. I don't know if it's a circumference area, like the pheromones releasing from the plant are a certain area. I don't know if the chemicals would be absorbed through the rhizosphere, rubbed off. I don't know this, but I'm just wondering, those are possibilities to me that seem not too far-fetched, and it seems like a lot less human intervention is needed.
So I think that is something that might be more for like the back 40 farmer, where you can maybe surround your field with I don't know why I want to take a wild stab in the guess. I want to say lavender repels a lot of pest insects. There's some purplish plant that repels a lot of pest insects. I forget what it is. But, I mean, when you're talking about like over 100-acre field, you plant the perimeter, even if you do like a grid system where you plant it in between, but then you're going to drive over it when you harvest everything else. And I want to say two things. So one, like if you're going like apples or blueberries or cherries or something, those crops they're only going to be monocultures. So that's not something we can do everywhere, as well as not most farmers don't have the margin to plant like a cover crop that's not going to net them any money. And some places they can do that, and they do that. But some farmers most farmers, I guess, live right on the edge of poverty and wealth, and throwing away maybe you do like a winter wheat or something, or there's some kind of um, off-season crop. It'd have to be a pretty big financial benefit. I mean, a lot of farmers don't even apply fertilizer if the prices weren't good that year, just because the margins are so small. And maybe this is something that goes into the farm bill about an offset of, maybe the United States population is willing to pay farmers to not use herbicides. And that's fine if the United States population wants to pay to not use it, I would say. I think my biggest problem is people want to not use pesticides, but also want to buy really low-cost food. But I think that might be a solution. I don't know. What do you think, Mike, about your idea with like a large scale, like a 100 to even say like 1,000-acre, plot of wheat or something?
So I think for large scale and small scale, it's easy. It's the medium scale that's the hardest to do. I think for large scale, if you're at that operational height, you have room for preventive measures of some square footage land in the middle of your crop to be lavender, or a mini forest to have natural plants and stuff like that to deflect. If you're a small farmer, you can be more experimental. Of course, that might be more risky because you might be living more hand to mouth. The medium farmer, I think, is the more person in a more delicate situation, because one mistake and now you're a small farmer. One correct choice, you're now a rich farmer. For me, the medium farmers are the highest at risk ones. Those are the ones that are precarious with the situation. It'd be nice if, like, say, a blueberry farmer, since you brought it up, and lavender trees are about the same height. If, I don't know, you can get some tax break from Uncle Sam going, if 1 out of 20 trees, so if you have your rows, right, 1 out of 20 it becomes a lavender instead of a blueberry, and you get X amount of tax cut, I'll be okay with that. Or that ground in between have some type of resilient grass or weed that helps deter, like releases pheromones for that, so you can run over it and it won't matter. That'd be nice. I think there are solutions. I just think we need to think on them.
Yeah, but that generally that ground in between is generally bare mineral soil because they don't want any competition with the blueberries and stuff like that. But
it doesn't always have to be just what the plant we're saying. This is an aptitude.
No, I know. I'm just saying. I think this is actually more almost of a political international trade issue than it is like a farmer issue. I mean, because a lot of there's man, I guess it's never been easy to be a farmer.
Oh, completely agree.
And we could, like, if the United States, if the citizens of the U.S. said, hey, no more pesticides, the first thing the citizens of the United States would do is turn around and buy cheaper products from outside the U.S. that are full of pesticides. And so I think you know, and for those of you who don't know, the U.S. does do a lot of grants for small organic farms, large organic farms, any non-pesticide stuff. It's pretty easy to get grants for your property if you don't spray pesticides compared to if you do. So they're already trying to financially incentivize people to use less pesticides. But I think there's not going to be a big change until, like I said, someone fucks up or the entire U.S. population says we're willing to bear the cost of not using pesticides, because the price of everything from wood to wheat to get off the W's, apples will skyrocket. And I think, which I do want to do a podcast on the Farm Bill because it is super interesting, because the Farm Bill is very socialist in nature. There's a lot of handouts, but those handouts are there for national defense because we want to grow food here. And I think it's just kind of an interesting mix of like everything. You got, like I said, defense, agriculture, morality, like just all around interesting. But yeah, I don't really see any large changes coming up until someone fucks up. That's my guess. And that's probably for most things, I would say. No matter what you are. I mean, humans are very reactive, especially the United States government is very reactive. We don't change until something bad happens.
What if I offered a third door? Instead of a red pill and a blue pill, I offered you a green pill. Pill called science. And God damn it, I love her. Now, a scientist by Greg Lurie at the Carnegie Mellon University has created a nanoparticle, well, specifically gold nanoparticle. It's mainly they use gold because it's easy to identify in a plant because plants don't have gold, so you can see how it goes through its system. But this nanoparticle that targets and uses the stomata, I believe that's how you pronounce it, of the leaves.
It's stomata?
Tomato. Of the leaves of the plant. So this method goes into the leaves, I just for lack of better words, pores, and goes through. Well, a lot of diseases, bacteria specifically, that like we were talking about, like rust.
It'd be like the lungs of the plant.
Pores work better for this analogy I'm making. So
okay,
I'm going to stick with pores. Pores are a great way for bacteria to get in and, diseases we were talking about, like rust. Well, these nanoparticle can go in there and help add a protective layer, can help introduce antibacterial bodies to it, and disease-preventing diseases into it. And because it's a nanoparticle, its half-life is even shorter than everything, all the rest of the molecules. It's also super effective because it doesn't get into, if I'm not mistaken, humans as easy for like skin contact because it's nanoparticle size that only fits certain structures. But here's the other cool part. We brought it up earlier with fertilizer. This method could be used to also dispense fertilizer directly to the plant. So not only would you be dropping your pesticides, you'd be dropping your herbicides in the same batch, and they would both beneficial to the plant. So you wouldn't have two different types of methodology of dispensing pesticides and herbicides and insecticides and fertilizer. They would be all combined into one, and it would just go.
Okay, hold on. I'm very confused right now. So generally, you do your fertilizer after your spray, your chemical spray, whatever your site prep, or your grass spray, because if you do your fertilizer first, you're applying that fertilizer to everything. So the nanobots can figure out your crop species and apply herbicide there only, and then not apply it to other stomata.
So say you have you have mixture A and mixture B. Mixture A being your pesticide, mixture B being your fertilizer. Well, you're growing soybeans, and soybeans.
How do I know you're from the Midwest?
Shut up.
Answer A, corn. Answer B, soybeans.
I can't help where I'm from. If we have that plant, the soybean plant, it needs, I can't remember what soybean needs. I think it needs phosphorus. If we mix in nanoparticles that contain phosphorus or whatever it needs, and we have the insecticide or pesticide in B, and we mix them together, right? And we can dispense them all at the same time. Because a lot of pesticides are, I would say, coating based. These with the nanoparticles, they can be the inside. So instead of wearing a hazmat suit to prevent getting the cold, you're now taking a vitamin to prevent yourself getting the cold. Does that make the analogy more simple, more understandable? Nanoparticles is taking a multivitamin, one that helps you grow, the fertilizer, and one that helps prevent diseases. That'd be the
right. So I understand what it's doing. What I don't understand is how it's targeting specific species.
I what do you mean? It's just like spraying.
So why is it so? It's only helping the soybeans, is what you're saying?
No, I just use
like it's only applying the herbicide or the fertilizer to the soybeans.
If you had a giant crops of like 8 different plants together, it'd probably get all of them, because I don't know the size of the stromata of the lungs of each plant. I imagine they're all kind of relatively the same size. That's just an educated guess here. It would get into all of them, but you'd have to use a lot less. It, I think, lasted longer because it's inside the system, and I think we can dispense different types of pesticides into it. This is very relatively new. Greg already came out with this, I believe, in June 2020. So that's why they were using gold instead of another pesticide. So it's very promising new research, but it seems like the fight against outside invaders, the insects, the diseases, is now going to be an internal fight of the plant rather than external fight of the plant. Because would you agree for most herbicides that it's almost like a coating for the plant?
So are you talking about the plant that we are trying to, like our crop species that we're trying to protect, that herbicides are like a coating to protect that plant?
Yes. If you spray a blueberry bush with herbicides, the pesticide isn't going directly into the blueberry plant. It's getting on top of their coating, they leave, so when bugs land on it and eat it, they die, breaks up their cycle, repels them by pheromones, etc., etc.
So I guess that would be how insecticide works, but herbicide that affects plants, it would get sprayed onto the leaves. Or into the ground, and then would get taken up into the plant through that way.
Yeah, and all right, for insecticides, then just humor me. You would agree with that? It's a coating.
Yes. Yeah, it's applied from the air, and it comes over and is on top of your crop species. So then your target species doesn't like it, goes away or dies depending on what you're using. Yes, it's like a coat of armor against insects.
Okay. Now imagine instead of having the armor, you have it internal. That'd be the nanoparticles. And if you can direct that with the herbicides, you make nanoparticles that.
So the nanoparticles what exactly would they do with the insects? Like they kill the insects? I'm confused how the nanoparticles are inside the plant and then affecting like the insects and stuff outside the plant.
All right, so when you spray insecticides on a plant, there's this thing called rain that sometimes washes them off. There's things called time, sun, air exposure, wind, all this stuff that removes them, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you have certain plants that produce their own insecticides, correct?
Yes. Okay, so it's essentially a shortcut to genetic modification, right? You're making it so the plants can produce their own toxins.
It's, to me, a great example would be the polio vaccine, where you get stabbed in the arm a little bit and you develop, I think that's polio, right? Is it polio or smallpox? The one where you get stabbed in the arm a bunch of times and a scab forms and that falls off? I think that's smallpox.
If I had to guess, it sounds like smallpox, but I have no idea.
It's kind of like that, where it's another system introduced into the plant to help the plant. It doesn't change the plant. It just combines a bad word for it. It just emphasizes the plant's features, I guess. It's a combination. So, like running. You can run barefoot, but having running shoes fucking helps. It's the running shoes for plants, nanoparticles.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. It kind of seems like a long walk for a short drink of water, which is pesticides. It seems like your solutions are all pesticides in
Yes, but
some form or another
this
at
is
less
no
rate.
this can now be changed, so we're now using more natural stuff, so it can change the plant more. Not change the plant more, but add features to the plant that other plants have without changing and genetically modifying the plants. Also
So
need
essentially, so you with these you'd be able to like, I don't know, like turn them off. Like so once you're ready to harvest. So say it's like a corn crop or something, right? Um, Once it's harvest time, you like what you EMP your field, and then that removes all the nanoparticles and their effects from the corn, kind of, or
no. So what
do you just eat them?
no, no to both. From what I
Oh,
understand of these nanoparticles, they're not
I wanted
advanced
to shit
robotics,
gold.
dude. So do I, Nick. So do I. From what I understand, is these nanoparticles have a cycle where they go into the leaves. They're much smaller, less chemicals are needed, less structures are needed. They get in the leaves, they prevent the insects, and then they go through the entire plant system and dispense through the roots. So so you just spray them when they're blooming, prevents them from getting eaten. By the time you harvest them, they're free and clear of what else. Again, this is
Gotcha.
all
So
very new. Hang on, this is all very new research. I mean, less than a year old. So it might be all hearsay. That's a huge asterisk on this, but it does have huge potential.
I mean, I believe it. I mean, the agriculture is, it may not seem like it, but probably one of the leading industries for new technologies. I'm curious if I don't know if you would know this, but are they reusable? Like, can you use them the next year again, or is it like a one-time deal?
This has only been done in the lab setting, and they've used gold because it was easy to follow gold through a plant's entire body because, well, X-rays, MRIs, and there's no gold in plants, so there's no interference. So they've yet to do real-world testing, but there's always a beginning to a good story.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that in the future we're gonna be have shit like that in all of our plants. I mean, but I think just like with pesticides, so this is something that people bring up all the time is plants, or specifically herbicides. Plants get resistant to certain herbicides, which is why you can't just use the same mix year after year. You really have to think about what you're doing because, like in my area, like dandelions, I think it's dandelions, they've grown a resistance to glyphosate some in certain areas just because of, like I said, glyphosate's what, like pretty old. They've been spraying glyphosate for a while, so the dandelions have had time to already go through so many evolutions that they can found a resistant gene, but you can still kill them with other herbicides. And so it's it's always a constant battle of finding a new solution to your problems. It's not the same thing year after year, but if you have, like you're saying, Mike, like some kind of like nanobot thing where you could maybe program it every year, then maybe we would be once again one step ahead of nature. And then the next year they'll take it back. And then the next year we'll take it back. Because try as hard as we can never control nature. We just have to learn to live with it.
See, a big promising for me for nanoparticles is we might not have to modify them year after year. We might be able to do Trojan horses inside the plant, inside the insects. So insects, I mean, resilient little creatures they are. I mean, hell, there's jokes that cockroaches can survive nuclear blast for a reason. Well, everything's hard to break from the outside, but inside we might have more effect. Getting the nanoparticles inside the insects, we might be able to do more damage to them, break up more cycles, make them desire new foods. I mean, hell, I didn't think about it until now, but we could genetically engineer, I don't know, let's say flies to target different crops than the crops they're currently going for and have them compete with other flies that are more natural based. Maybe instead of genetically modifying plants, we genetically modify insects, which also sounds like a horrible idea and a great story for a horror movie. But if we create new competition amongst their own species, but we control which species likes what food, it's also another possible avenue.
Well, Mike, like they said in Starship Troopers, the only good bug is a dead bug.
I have not seen that movie in a very long time.
Just another problem that pesticides might have solved.
Well, this is a little way off topic, but I'm surprised they didn't use that in the movies. You didn't see like any chemtrails going on.
Yeah, that's we were a long time in the future, but still somehow in the past.
Well, Nick, do you have anything else to add with pesticides?
I think we touched on a lot. I mean, if anyone has any questions, you can hit us up on our YouTube or Instagram and shoot us a question. I do this stuff for work, so hopefully I can solve your problem.
Can they find us on Twitter?
No, you cannot find us on Twitter.
Say the line, Nick.
Because Twitter is a dumpster fire.
Yay! I love that every time. But out of curiosity, Nick, when you're not spraying pesticides or out in the woods or handling our social media, what books are you reading?
I'm currently reading kind of in between books. So in the meantime, I'm reading a book called Deep Survival, The Science of Who Lives and Who Dies in Survival Situations. So, yeah, what are you reading, Mike?
I am finishing up Dune. I'm on book 3, the last couple chapters, and yeah, I'm excited for the new movie, which they seem to remake a new movie every couple years, so this could probably fit in any time you listen to this podcast. But I like Dune. I even rereading it. I'm not a big fan of rereading books, so that says the testimony of how good Dune is. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Backyard Philosophy Podcast. We rarely finish a podcast without missing a point we wanted to bring up, so let us know what we forgot. And if you have a topic you want us to talk about, let us know at Backyard Philosophy on Instagram and Backyard Philosophy Podcast on Facebook.